Welcome to week 6 of our study of the Old Testament survey. We are continuing in our study of the major prophets of the Old Testament. Last week we considered Isaiah's prophecy. And in week 6 we're going to give consideration to the prophecy of Jeremiah. The second of the major prophets has been called by several different names. Jeremiah has been referred to as the weeping prophet, the martyr prophet, and God's iron pillar. When we read the prophecy of Isaiah, it's quickly discernible that he is one of the most interesting prophets simply because we know so much about his life in comparison to some of the other prophets in the Old Testament. In order to appreciate the prophet Jeremiah, we really need to give attention to three different types of information that are revealed to us in his prophecy. We need to give consideration to his personal circumstances, his public ministry, and the political context in which he lived and in which he prophesied. Let's think first of all about personal circumstances surrounding the life of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah's name means either Yahweh appoints or Yahweh establishes. When we look at verse 1 of his prophecy, it gives us basic personal information about this prophet, the prophet Jeremiah. We learn there that Jeremiah was a priest, actually, before he was a prophet. His father, Hilkiah, may have been the famous high priest who had played such a significant role in the Reformation of 621 BC. And we'll talk about that a little further into our discussion today. There's probably no doubt about the fact that Jeremiah would have accompanied his father to the temple in his childhood and in his young adulthood. He would have learned by observation, by just watching his father, the vocation which he anticipated entering into when he reached the age of 30, the age at which a priest would actually engage in that ministry. Jeremiah grew up in the village of Anathoth, which was a priestly village, and Anathoth was a village that was about 3 miles north of Jerusalem. It was in the area of the tribal area, actually, of Benjamin. Now let's give our attention for a few moments to the political background. And the political background of the prophecy of Jeremiah is absolutely crucial for us to understand his message and his ministry. There are 3 kings that are named in the first book of the prophecy of Jeremiah, but there are actually 2 other kings who reigned during this ministry of Jeremiah, but they aren't mentioned in this first verse. They're actually omitted, and we'll see the reason for that in just a moment. As you can see on this list, the reign of Josiah, the first king, lasted from 640 to 609 BC. But then we see that the reign of Jehoahaz only lasted during the year 609 BC. His name is not mentioned in the first verse. The third king that we have mentioned is the reign of Jehoiakim. He reigned from 609 to 598 BC. And then the fourth king is Jehoiachin. He again reigned less than a year, and his name is omitted from the first verse in the book. And then lastly, we have the reign of Zedekiah from 597 to 586 BC. He is actually the last king in the Old Testament historical record. Now let's give consideration to each of these just briefly. First of all, the reign of Josiah from 640 to 609 BC. Jeremiah was actually called into the prophetic ministry during the reign of Josiah. It was actually the 13th year of the reign of Josiah in 627 BC. We learn from this book that Josiah was a godly man, and even from his youth, he was a godly man and strived to serve the Lord in his office. When Josiah began to rule, Judah was simply a vassal state within the Assyrian Empire. This vassalage required the Jews to venerate Assyrian deities. Now, again, God has always demanded total, absolute allegiance, and he would always judge those who would in any way embrace the worship of other so-called deities. So, during this period of time, idolatry was prevalent in Judah. In the 8th year of Josiah's reign, when he was only 16 years old, and this is really an amazing fact, when he was only 16 years old, Josiah seriously began to seek the God of his father David. And in his 12th year, at the age of 20, still a young man, Josiah began to purge Jerusalem of idolatry. In the 13th year of Josiah, Jeremiah was called as a prophet to the nations. Jeremiah was reluctant. He did not want to accept the challenge that was extended to him by God, and it was certainly a desperate challenge from his viewpoint to face the nation and the idolatric practices that had been infiltrated into the worship of Israel. And you can understand easily why he was reluctant to accept his call. He identifies himself as but a youth, and that may mean that actually he was no more than just a teenager when he accepted this call of God. And you can imagine the pressure that he must have felt at that young age to face all the idolatry and all the practices that had been embraced by the people of Judah. It would appear that the first major milestone in Jeremiah's ministry was the Reformation that's recorded that took place in the 18th year of Josiah. A scroll of the law of God was found by the high priest Hilkiah. It was buried in debris in the temple, so it shows you that they had very little regard for the word of God. But when this scroll was found of the law of God and presented to Josiah, it pricked his heart and his conscience and began a great movement of reformation. After Josiah confirmed that the threats and curses that were contained in the scroll of the law of God were still valid, he then intensified his campaign to cleanse the land, the entire land of Judah, from all of their practices of idolatry. Jeremiah was very, very likely an active participant in this effort of reformation. It's thought that most of the sermonic material that's recorded in chapters 2 through 7 of Jeremiah's prophecy may have actually grown out of the context of this great reformation under Josiah's kingship. For 18 years of his ministry, actually until the end of Josiah's life, Jeremiah had the support of the crown in his preaching efforts, and that is such an amazing fact to consider. That the court of the king gave ear and attention to the prophetic messages of Josiah. So during those years, Jeremiah's message was received. Josiah then died when he engaged Pharaoh Necho in battle at the pass of Megiddo in 609 BC. And it is such an interesting account. Pharaoh actually had no quarrel at all with Josiah. But for some reason, Josiah felt compelled to confront Pharaoh. And he was mortally wounded in this battle, and it ended his reign as ruler of Judah. A sad ending to a rather illustrious life and rule. The second king mentioned in, he's not mentioned in verse 1, but the second king during this historical period is Jehoahaz. He only ruled in 609 BC. The people of the land anointed Shalem as king in the place of his father Josiah. And then Shalem took the name of Jehoahaz as his throne name, as his king name. He only ruled 3 months, and then he was summoned to Riblah by Pharaoh Necho, and then he was put in chains at Riblah and taken to Egypt. Jeremiah announced that Shalem would die in the place where they had carried him captive, and indeed he did, just according to Jeremiah's word. The third king, the second king mentioned there in verse 1, is Jehoiakim. He ruled from 609 BC to 598 BC. And Pharaoh Necho actually selected him, his name, his birth name was Eliakim, selected him to be the new king, and then Necho gave him the name Jehoiakim as his name on the throne, as king. This king was placed under an enormous annual tribute to Egypt. And in 605 BC, when Necho was defeated by Nebuchadnezzar in the Battle of Carchemish, Jehoiakim then switched allegiance from his allegiance to Egypt to an allegiance to Babylon. It actually made him an extremely crafty man who was able to keep himself on the throne for 11 years. Now, in all likelihood, those were the most miserable years of Jeremiah's ministry. His life was constantly in jeopardy. Jehoiakim actually was the target of some of Jeremiah's most harsh criticism and predictions, and because of that, he was not taken very well. His message was not received by the king because of the strong indictments that Jeremiah was bringing against him. Number 4 is the reign of Jehoiachin, and again, his name is not mentioned in verse 1, but he did reign for approximately 3 months. Jehoiakim died a natural death, apparently, in 598 BC, and he was succeeded by his son, Coniah, who took the throne name Jehoiachin. After just reigning over 3 months, this young king was forced to surrender to Nebuchadnezzar. And at that time, he was actually deported to Babylon with 10,000 of his subjects. Jeremiah had actually predicted that no descendant of Jehoiachin would ever successfully sit upon the throne of David in Judah. That prophecy is found in chapter 22, verse 30. And then the final king that's recorded in verse 1 is actually the last king of Judah before their fall to Babylon. And his reign lasted from 597 to 586 BC, a reign of 11 years. He was actually installed by Nebuchadnezzar, and his name was Mattaniah, but his name was then changed to the throne name Zedekiah. And again, he was just a vassal king that reported directly to Babylon. This last Old Testament king ruled again for 11 years, and he was under constant pressure from all of his advisors to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. But we see clearly that Jeremiah, in contradiction and in opposition to those who would counsel him to rebel against Babylon, Jeremiah urged Zedekiah to surrender to Babylon, saying that was the only way that Judah would survive. The king couldn't resist, though, the pressure to seek an alliance with Egypt against Nebuchadnezzar. And this maneuvering by this king actually led to the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. So we see that Jeremiah lived through some tumultuous political times. During the reign of Josiah, his message was received, welcomed, and obeyed. But for all the other kings that he was prophesying during their rule, he was not gladly accepted. His message was not received. and he ultimately suffered tremendously at their hands. Now let's give our attention to his public ministry. Jeremiah's ministry, as we've already said, extended from his call in 627 BC to well beyond the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. So his ministry extended for over 4 decades. And when we consider his ministry, as recorded in his prophecy, we see that it was a multi-dimensional ministry. First of all, clearly he had a ministry of preaching. He was a powerful preacher. His sermons are actually filled with emotion, and he used so many different word pictures, metaphors, to paint vivid pictures of the sin and apostasy of the people of Judah. Number 2, Jeremiah used drama. He was actually a pretty good actor as well as a preacher. He dramatized his message from time to time and occasion to occasion. And he did this in order to attract the attention of his audience and to give more weight to the message and the truths that he was preaching. Among his props that he used in his dramatic presentations were a dirty girdle, a pottery jar, a cup of wine, an ox yoke. And by the way, just as an aside here, sometimes in our preaching ministry, it would be good to use a dramatic presentation. I do this from time to time as I dress in a biblical costume and give a monologue from the viewpoint of a biblical character. It's a great way to present the message that we preach constantly and consistently, but to do it in a different way. So use Jeremiah's example here and incorporate some different styles of presenting the gospel as you have your preaching ministry. Number 3, Jeremiah was involved in a writing ministry. We know that because he wrote this book, but he also wrote a lament over the death of Josiah. He wrote a letter to Babylon. It's referred to in Jeremiah 29. He wrote this book that bears his name, and probably, according to many Bible scholars, probably the biblical books of Lamentations and Kings. So he was a very prolific writer as well. And again, let me encourage you, if you have the opportunity to engage in a writing ministry through blogs, through social media, or through articles in your local newspapers or things of that, then I would encourage you to do that. Let our voices be heard in every different avenue that's made available to us. We can again learn this example from the prophecy of Jeremiah. Number 4, it's obvious that Jeremiah was a praying man. A deep, deep part of his life and ministry was given over to prayer. He was completely persistent in his intercession for his people, in spite of repeated indications that all of his efforts were falling on deaf ears and that his efforts were hopeless in the light of the current events of his day. But he was a man given to prayer. In his prophecy, there's actually several of his prayers that are recorded. We have a prayer of complaint in chapter 4, verse 10, a prayer of perception, chapter 5, verse 3, a prayer of praise in chapter 10, 6 and following, a prayer for clarification in chapter 32, verses 16 through 23. There is so much in this book recorded of the prayer life of the prophet Jeremiah. So please, again, take note of that and take it to heart in your own ministry. Number 5, Jeremiah was a true statesman. Isaiah was indeed a true statesman. These men were very supportive of national reformation and revival efforts under the kings under which they ruled and prophesied. So be a statesman, be a patriot, but do it in a way that always exalts and glorifies our Lord and never exalts and glorifies those who hold to any political office or any political affiliation. As a statesman, Jeremiah saw clearly that Babylon was going to rule the world. God revealed to him that Babylon was going to actually rule the world for 70 years. And although he consistently urged submission to Babylon, Jeremiah was no traitor. He was dedicated. He was a true statesman, a true patriot of Judah. And we can learn that we can do that in a godly way, always with the intent and the purpose and the desire to exalt God. After Jerusalem's fall in 586, Jeremiah was actually given the option of spending the rest of his life under royal patronage in Babylon. He chose rather to remain with the remnant of his people in the land of Judah that had been so devastated by the Babylonian invasion, and so he remained there as his own choice instead of going to Babylon. A sixth component of Jeremiah's ministry was counseling. Jeremiah actually ministered privately to individuals as well as to the masses. He was truly equipped as a counselor. And again, in your pastoral ministry or whatever ministry God leads you into, you're probably going to have occasion to be involved in personal counseling. Take advantage of these opportunities and use them to truly encourage people to submit themselves to the rule and the leadership of God in their lives. We see in this book that 5 times Jeremiah cried out to God from what we would refer to as the absolute depths of doubt and discouragement. God indeed answered the prophet's confessions, and Jeremiah was able to get back on track in his ministry. There are going to be times that we're going to go through very dry and difficult and discouraging times in ministry. Let's learn from Jeremiah that God is there for us. He doesn't turn his back on us when we go through periods of doubt and discouragement. He is always there to encourage us and to lift us back up and to get us back on track, as he did with the prophet Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah has been called the weeping prophet. That goes without even saying, doesn't it? Jeremiah was a broken man. He was broken over the plight of his people. He was broken over the godlessness of Israel and Judah. 3 distinct aspects of his personal suffering can be identified in this book. First of all, there's a ministerial aspect to his suffering. Jeremiah experienced tremendous agony because of the message of judgment. He saw clearly in a vision from God that the land that he so deeply and dearly loved was going to be destroyed. He actually was given a vision by God of the suffering of men and women and children in horrific ways. If you think his message was painful to deliver, think about the reception of that message. The people that he loved so dearly, the people he knew, were standing on the very brink of national destruction. And yet they refused to listen. They refused to listen and repent and turn back to God so that God might intervene on their behalf and save them from impending destruction. The men of his very own hometown, people that he grew up with, people that he probably played with as a child, actually plotted his death. He couldn't even trust members of his own family. His own family members turned against him. When he made the assertion that Jerusalem and its temple would be destroyed, the prophet Jeremiah was actually branded as a heretic and threatened with death. There's also a psychological aspect to Jeremiah's ministry. There were times that Jeremiah suffered extreme loneliness. That only intensified the agony that he was already going through because of his being rejected because of his message and ministry. Jeremiah was a man who truly needed someone to be sympathetic toward him. A wife would have been great, would it not? Just someone to be by his side, some companion, but God actually ordered him to never marry. Jeremiah was truly a loner. And through his loneliness, out of his loneliness, he would preach a powerful message. It was no time for parties. There was nothing to celebrate. There was only woe and misery on the horizon. And then thirdly, there's a physical aspect to Jeremiah's public ministry. Jeremiah's agony had physical implications and dimensions as well as psychological dimensions. We're going to give our attention now to the book itself. There's so much that we've already studied and spoken of here in Jeremiah's life, his ministry, the different aspects of his ministry, the different aspects of his misery. But let's give our attention now to the teachings of the book itself. In some ways, Jeremiah is actually a very easy book to read. But yet, even when we just have a cursory, surface level reading of the book, we can note that there are some problems with this book that are not easily solved. Jeremiah had been preaching 23 years before he was instructed to record his sermons on a scroll. The prophet dictated his messages to the scribe Baruch. The first edition of the book of Jeremiah was actually destroyed in 604 by the tyrant King Jehoiakim. God then commissioned Jeremiah to produce another scroll, a second scroll. This second edition of the book contained all the words of the first scroll that Jeremiah had written, and then had the addition of many similar words as well. We see this aspect recorded in chapter 36, verse 32. A third edition of the book must have been produced by Baruch in Egypt after the death of Jeremiah. This edition, this Egyptian edition, must have actually been considerably larger than the second edition. It would have contained the record of the last 20 years of the prophet's ministry. This third edition of Jeremiah was produced somewhere around 560 BC. This date is suggested based on the assumption that it contained chapter 52. The last event mentioned in this chapter is the release of the Judean king Jehoiachin, which can be dated to 560 BC. A hasty copy of this edition of the book was made by Baruch when he immigrated to Babylon. It was there that he produced the fourth edition of the book. Certain additional oracles of the prophet were added, and all the material was reorganized. There are some problems with understanding how the book in its final form came to us, and this is one of the difficulties of understanding the entire message of the prophecy of Jeremiah. This Babylonian edition became what was obviously the prototype for the standard Hebrew form of the book, which has now been translated into English. But as you can see, the prophecy of Jeremiah, this book that bears his name, obviously went through several emendations before it reached its final form. This reconstruction of the book of Jeremiah may help to explain why the Greek translation, the Septuagint of the Bible, translated in about 250 BC, is actually pretty different from the standard Hebrew edition of the book that bears Jeremiah's name. Perhaps the translators of the Septuagint, perhaps they based their translation on the Egyptian edition of the books, which was copied by the Jews in Egypt before Baruch immigrated to Babylon. And again, this would account for the rather substantial differences in the two forms of the text of Jeremiah. The arrangement of the materials in the book of Jeremiah has also been called the most confusing in the Old Testament. Large blocks of material are in chronological order, but here and there, chapters are inserted which jump either forward or backward in time. So we really can't look at the book as a chronological work from beginning to end. Jeremiah, or perhaps Baruch, who edited the book, must have grouped the material at times according to a topic rather than to a chronological order. But chapter 1 is intended to be an introduction to the entire book is certainly clear enough. Chapter 1 narrates the prophetic call of Jeremiah in 627 BC, and the remaining chapters are arranged then in two main divisions that are not necessarily in chronological order. Chapters 2 through 25 are actually the first major division of the book, and these chapters are mainly pre-605 BC. This, again, was the year of the Battle of Carchemish, the fourth year of King Jehoiakim, and the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Chapters 26 through 51 then form the second major division of the book, and these chapters are more biographical in form, and for the most part, they are dated after 605 BC. Chapter 52 then is apparently an appendix describing the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC and the deportation of many Jews to Babylon. So this was an addendum probably added by Baruch. According to Barton Payne, the book of Jeremiah contains 90 different specific predictions. This total ranks second only to Isaiah. This is a remarkable statistic to consider. 90 different specific predictions. Approximately 812 verses, actually 60% of the total verses in the book of Jeremiah are predictive. 60% of the total. Again, that's an amazing statistic. The majority of these are predictive verses focusing on the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. And among the more outstanding political prophecies of the book are the following. Number 1, Jeremiah predicted precisely that the Babylonian captivity would be 70 years in duration. He also predicted Nebuchadnezzar's invasion of Egypt. He predicted the capture of Babylon by Cyrus. He predicted the defeat of Pharaoh Necho at Carchemish. The book of Jeremiah, it doesn't contain nearly as much messianic prophecy as Isaiah does, but the prophecies pointing to Christ and his kingdom are not lacking in the prophecy of Jeremiah. Perhaps the most important of those is the famous New Covenant prophecy that we find in chapter 31, verse 31. Two prophecies are noteworthy in the personal messianic category. The first is a future leader, the righteous shoot, will reign and rule over the united tribes. That's found in chapter 23, verse 5. And the second is this ruler will enjoy priestly as well as royal privileges. So Jeremiah prophesied of the priestly aspect of the Messiah as well as the kingly aspect of the Messiah. Now, before we close today, we have to give consideration for a few minutes to Lamentations. Now, of course, Lamentations is thought to have been written by Jeremiah, And it is most specifically that we get the term the weeping prophet from the book of Lamentations. This collection of poems that's known as the Book of Lamentations really doesn't get nearly enough attention from Christian teaching. Walter Kaiser actually has described it as the orphan book of the Bible. That's sad commentary, but that's one man's perspective on the Book of Lamentation. It's the orphan book of the Bible. Maybe Kaiser made his assessment because the book is perceived to be so somber and gloomy. Lamentations truly are a painful outburst of a suffering people. And rightly so, when we give consideration to the reason for the writing of this particular book. But Lamentations is actually much, much more than one person's cheerless protest of the inequalities and inequities of life. These poems actually are an affirmation of faith in the justice and the goodness of God in the face of the injustice and the wickedness of man. The author, one who penned the words of Lamentations, has personally experienced the worst that life can offer. He's experienced the worst by way of pain and sorrow, by way of senseless violence, by way of personal loneliness. And yet, he has an attitude and an eye of faith that seems to somehow penetrate the despair and actually focuses on the living God who is above all the eventualities of life, no matter how painful those eventualities happen to be. Actually, no book in the Bible is better designed to help believers cope with all sorts of difficulties and dilemmas and calamities of life. When we consider the history of Lamentations, it's like other Old Testament books originally took its form from its first Hebrew word. This same word is found at the beginning of the second and the fourth chapters as well. Very early, the book came to have the expanded title of the Lamentations of Jeremiah. Early Jewish teachers considered these 5 poems as actually an appendix to the book of Jeremiah rather than a book standing alone. By about AD 100, Lamentations had actually been removed from its position as an appendix to Jeremiah and then placed in the 3rd division of the Hebrew Bible, the writings. The background of Lamentations is the fall of Jerusalem to the Chaldeans in 586 BC. So everything we read in these poems needs to be read in the light of that event. There's much physical suffering that's associated with this historical time period. The suffering associated with the 18 months of the siege was truly bad enough. The spiritual implications of that time, the loss of Zion and the temple, made this event psychologically devastating on top of the physical devastation that they suffered. Events demonstrated that the basic tenet of their theology, the inviolability of Jerusalem, was erroneous. Now, this is a principle that was clearly taught in Jeremiah's prophecy. The people obviously had the idea that because they had the temple of God, that they were inviolable, that no one, no nation could ever invade and destroy the temple. Well, Lamentations proves that that tenet of their theology, their belief, was completely wrong. A feeling of abandonment by God made the shock and the grief over their national and personal loss that much more difficult to bear. Lamentations then underscores the comfort which the Bible has for those who suffer. It teaches us clearly that where pain and hurt are prevalent and present, that there God is also. The book of Lamentations consists of 4 dirges, chapters 1 through 4, and then 1 prayer, chapter 5. These are all designed to capture the sense of outrage and discouragement and despondency and despair which the people felt after Jerusalem had fallen to the hands of the Babylonians. The first 4 chapters in the book are in the form of alphabetical acrostics. The author begins each verse with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Chapters 1, 2, and 4 have 22 verses, one for each letter of the alphabet, and chapter 3 consists of 66 verses, and the 3 consecutive verses begin with each successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So the author was a poet as well as a prophet. Though it contains 22 verses, chapter 5 is not an acrostic. It's a prayer of lamentation. Well, who exactly wrote the Lamentations? It doesn't actually identify the author in the context of the book itself. There is a great deal of external and internal evidence, though, that is embraced by many that forces us to believe that Jeremiah was actually the author of Lamentations as well as the book that bears his name. That Jeremiah was acquainted with the techniques of lamentation is clear from the writing that's attested in his prophecy, especially what we see in by way of his laments in the book, as well as 2 Chronicles chapter 35, verse 25. The Greek version of the book, translated again about 200 BC, contains a heading which actually attributes the book to Jeremiah. Jewish and Christian tradition both, is pretty much unanimous in assigning Lamentations to the famous prophet Jeremiah, even though there are those who would dispute and disagree with that assessment. The purpose of Lamentations actually gave expression to the agony of a people who were just filled with distress. It's a masterpiece in engaging our minds and our hearts with the suffering and the struggle that we go through in times of personal loss and personal suffering. So psychologically, it serves that purpose. Liturgically, the poems that are recorded here in these chapters served as a means by which the congregation of Israel could actually express sorrow over their national loss at the hands of the Babylonians. Theologically, the book served to help the people maintain their faith in God, even in the midst of overwhelming disaster. So, in both of these books, Jeremiah and Lamentations, we see the heart cry of a man who is filled with the power of God, who is faced with such extenuating circumstances and yet never loses sight of the fact that God is in control. So we need to learn these lessons from these 2 books, that we are going to go through times of discouragement, perhaps moments of depression. Perhaps we'll see episodes of national destruction. And yet in the midst of all that, God is still on the throne. Next week, we'll give our attention to the prophecy of Ezekiel, I hope you've enjoyed this week's discussion, and you'll enjoy doing your assignments for this week. God bless you as you continue your studies. Thank you for the hard work you're putting into it, and I'll look forward to being with you again next week by way of video audio. God bless you.